Good day. Today, Friday, 6th January, we have clear indications that we seem to be drifting. Let's say I mean the United States and the collective West, that we seem to be drifting into a larger war in the Middle East. And I would suggest that there's also signs of a potential further escalation in terms of the US's support for Ukraine in the conflict that is taking place in that tormented country. Let me start, first of all, with the situation in Ukraine, as I traditionally do in these programs. And the event that has sparked my latest comment about the fact that the United States seems to be drifting into an escalation of the war in Ukraine, a further escalation of its military aid, is certain comments made by Admiral Kirby at the National Security Council about alleged Russian use of North Korean ballistic missiles in the strikes that Russia has recently launched against Ukraine. Now, what, of course, Kirby is talking about is the big Russian missile strikes, the one on the 29th of December and the 2nd of January, most specifically. Though it's important to say that there have been many other Russian strikes which have taken place across Ukraine in the last couple of days and weeks, but the two big ones were the ones that took place on those 2 days. And before I continue, there's been a comment now from one of the Ukrainian Telegram channels. From memory, I think it was Legitimi. These are Telegram channels, Resident and Legitimi, which, as I said previously, I believe have some kind of connection to General Zaluzhny and to officials of the Ukrainian General Staff. Certainly they appear to be fed with information from those sources. But anyway, this particular Telegram channel, as I said, I think it was Legitimi, came forward and said that the Ukrainian claim that nearly all of the Russian missiles that were launched against Kiev on the 2nd of January were shot down is incredible. People in Kiev know that it is untrue. There's been clear indications that at least half the missiles got through and did enormous damage, and that making these improbable and fantastic claims, no doubt in part intended to protect the reputations of the Western weapons that Ukraine has been supplied with, that all it does in the end, however, is damage the Ukrainian government's credibility. And by the way, we're now getting reports from Polish sources which suggest that at least 3 NASAMS missiles batteries have been destroyed. And I noticed that the latest package of military aid to Ukraine from Germany includes replacement missiles for the IRIS-T systems, which perhaps also highlights the level of damage that has been done. So these are these big missile strikes which have done all the enormous damage. I've discussed this extensively now in recent programs. Even Ukrainian publications are now increasingly talking about this. And these are the missile strikes that John Kirby is talking about. And, well, he doesn't quite explain the devastating impact of these missile strikes by the use by the Russians of North Korean missiles, but he is talking about Russia now using North Korean missiles. And I should say straight away that I have no means either to confirm or refute what Admiral Kirby has said. He's not provided much in the way of evidence convincing evidence that this is the case. I've been tracking the two missile attacks with great attention. It is undoubtedly the case that the Russians did launch some ballistic missiles in conjunction with these attacks, but principally, most of the missiles that were used, especially in the one on the 2nd of January, were airborne, air-launched missiles, the KH-101s, which are subsonic, but also in the missile strike on the 2nd of January, it does seem as if around a dozen hypersonic Kinzhal missiles were used, and it does seem that it was these missiles, the Kinzhal missiles, that did the biggest damage. Perhaps not the greatest damage in aggregate, but it does seem that where these Kinzhal missiles struck, that this was where the most devastating damage was done. And my own understanding is that the North Korean missile, or rather the missiles, the ballistic missiles, to the extent that they were used, that they were played a secondary role, a very secondary role in this strike. Anyway, Admiral Kirby says that the Russians have now tested these North Korean missiles as part of these strikes. They're said to be very similar to the Russian Iskander-M ballistic missiles. Supposedly, they have a longer range than the Iskander-M ballistic missiles, which is presumably why the Russians would use them, if you believe Admiral Kirby. But I have to say, I remain of the view that despite the maps that he provided and the indications of the distances that these missiles are supposed to have flown over, greater than the Iskander-M, supposedly. Well, I have to say, to me, it didn't look like a completely convincing explanation. And I have to say this, we've been hearing lots of rumors about North Korean weapons appearing on the Ukrainian battlefields. Allegedly, Russia has received millions of shells, at least 1 million shells, 152 millimeter and 122 millimeter shells from North Korea. There are claims that these North Korean shells have actually been used on the battlefronts. Again, actually, there isn't a huge amount of evidence that this is the case. It's just something that people are reporting and repeating, and of course when people report and repeat something, well, usually something that could be called evidence appears to confirm it. And I have to say the same is true with these North Korean missiles. I want to stress again, I don't know whether this report is true or not. The Russians obviously are not confirming it. The North Koreans are not confirming it. There have been instances when the Russians have used weapons that they've imported. They definitely imported Shahid drones from Iran. They've set up a factory to produce similar drones. These are the Uranium-2 drones that they now use on such quantities over Ukraine pretty much every night now. It's not impossible that the Russians have imported shells and missiles from North Korea, but one would like to see more evidence of this. Now, I'm going to suggest that, putting aside whether or not this story is even true, there might be something of an agenda on the part of Admiral Kirby and the US government in bringing up this topic of these North Korean missiles. First, of course, and this is made quite clear by Admiral Kirby himself in his presentation, is that it's intended, I think, to persuade people in Congress, the Republicans in Congress, to authorize funding for the war in Ukraine. If there is one country that is even less popular amongst political leaders in Washington than Russia, it is presumably North Korea, pointing to the fact that North Korea and Russia might be working together as allies, that North Korea is itself in some form a party to the conflict. Well, that might perhaps possibly persuade some Congress people who are doubtful about providing financial aid to Ukraine to come round and to do so. So I think that is clearly one potential explanation behind this story, one reason why the Americans might be coming up with this account now. The second, I suspect also, is to explain the devastating effect of these Russian missile strikes. As I said, all the indications are that the major damage was done first and foremost by the Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, but to some extent also by the KH-101 subsonic missiles that were also used. But of course, the United States and Ukraine have spent much of the last year discounting the effectiveness of both missiles, especially the Kinzhal. We're repeatedly told that the Patriot missile system has been effective in shooting down Kinzhal missiles. I discussed in a recent program how there might be a grain of truth in this, but even if you accept the explanation provided that some Kinzhal missiles, the odd Kinzhal missile, might indeed have been intercepted with the use of Israeli Iron Dome radars working in conjunction with Patriot missiles. Even this account concedes that the number of times when that is going to happen is extremely small, and most of the time the Kinzhals, nearly all the time, the Kinzhals will nonetheless get through. But that, of course, is not the impression that many people in the media in the West have been given. The story there is that the Kinzhal has flopped, that the Patriot has defeated it, and you have now to try and explain why that appears not to be the case, why Ukrainian military-industrial complexes and factories and air defense missiles are being destroyed, and how better to do that than by bringing up North Korean ballistic missiles instead of the Kinzhals. But I am afraid I think that there is another explanation, and a rather more troubling one. And that goes back to those comments made some days ago by the Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski. His wife, Anna Applebaum, is of course American, and he's very well connected to the leadership, the political leadership of the United States. And I suspect that this has been widely talked about and discussed, what I'm going to discuss now, widely talked about and discussed now privately within official circles in Washington. And I've noticed that the military summary channel, DIMA, has recently been discussing the various Ukrainian drone and missile strikes towards Crimea, all of which have been unsuccessful. But DIMA at the military summary channel has also pointed to the fact that the Ukrainians do seem to have been trying to launch missile strikes at Novorossiysk, another port on the Black Sea, another Russian port on the Black Sea, definitely within the territory of 1991 Russia. And of course, there's suggestions that they're doing this with all different types of aircraft and missiles. Suggested it might be Neptune missiles. I've seen that suggestion, which are, of course, Ukrainian built. But anyway, the fact that the Ukrainians are trying to launch missile strikes against Novorossiysk, so far without success, it must be said, which is out of range of the current versions of the ATACMS missile and of the Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles that Ukraine possesses. All of that, going back to what Sikorsky was saying, may point towards a larger plan to supply Ukraine with longer range missiles, which it can then use to strike targets within Russia itself. Continuing to provide Ukraine with air defense missiles is not working. The Russian hypersonic missiles have shown that they can penetrate this Western air defense system. It is turning out to be more fragile than had been assumed to be the case. So you have to try and find some counter, so you start talking about longer range missiles. Taurus missiles from Germany, conceivably Tomahawk missiles also from the United States, though no one so far has mentioned those. Now, I did notice that a German official has just again said that Germany has not yet made a final decision whether or not to supply Taurus missiles to Ukraine, which, however, confirms that the decision is still under consideration and that the decision to supply these missiles will soon be made. And I suspect that there is now pressure within the United States to supply Tomahawk missiles as well. And how do you justify doing that, given all that you have been saying for the last couple of years about not permitting missile strikes on Russian territory? Well, you conjure up the spectre of Russian use of North Korean missiles. You say, since the Russians are using North Korean missiles to strike at Ukraine, they're buying missiles of this nature from a rogue regime. Let us go forward and supply long-range missiles so that Ukraine can somehow equalize the balance by carrying out its own strikes against Russia. And of course, the logic is flawed, but since when has logic mattered in terms of Western decisions in this war? Now, this would be a major escalation, and I think it's important to stress that, long-range missiles, the State Department has just issued a statement saying that long-range missile, that the United States does intend to continue to support Ukraine, but that the support that the United States will be providing to Ukraine this year and presumably next year will be at a reduced level as compared to that in 2022 and 2023. And in fact, we can see that in many categories of weapons, the United States is no longer capable of supplying Ukraine with weapons to the extent that it once could because, well, straightforwardly, the supply of these weapons has now become depleted. There's not enough javelins, there's not enough stingers. M777 howitzers have performed adequately, but not brilliantly, on the Ukrainian battlefields, but Ukraine has run through most of those. 155mm ammunition is now in desperately short quantity, so we can only supply a limited number of those. The Abrams tanks apparently have been found to be unsuitable for use on the Ukrainian battlefields. The Leopard 2s and the Bradleys are easily destroyed by the Russians. The F-16s are coming along, but nobody really expects that they're going to make a huge difference So you can supply long-range missiles. They're relatively cheap, or so I understand. So fewer dollars goes a longer way with these types of missiles, and they require less expensive infrastructure. They don't require the complex radars and command bunkers that air defense missiles do. And of course, air defense missiles, the Patriots and the NASAMs and the IRIS-Ts, as we've seen, are not working especially well. So you can supply these long-range missiles instead, and even if you don't get $61 billion in aid from Congress, funding from Congress, if you get, say, $20 billion, well, $20 billion will buy you a lot of long-range missiles, of Taurus missiles and Tomahawk missiles, of which I understand that the US reserve stock is around 4,000, which is a substantial number, but not, it must be stressed, an immense one. Anyway, that's, I think, where we are heading. It is an extremely dangerous thing that the United States is doing. It's now moving steadily from a position where it said that it would not support, in fact, would oppose Ukrainian strikes on Russian territory. What the United States admits is Russian territory. Now is about, or so it seems to me, to cross that particular red line. We saw that with the Ukrainian attack on Belgorod. There was a recent Ukrainian attack on Belgorod. I discussed it in my programs. It was carried out apparently with Czech-supplied Vampire multiple launch rocket systems, Western weapons, or these NATO weapons. In other words, nobody particularly shocked or worried about that in the West, barely reported in the West. That was an attack on a Russian city in Russia proper, what the West even concedes was Russia. And we can see how steadily the West is now moving towards supplying Ukraine with long-range missiles, crossing its own red line and deciding that from now on, missile strikes on Russia are something that Ukraine ought to be allowed to do. Now, 2 days ago, I discussed an article in the Financial Times which talked about this other project that has been launched by Britain and the United States and which seems to be heading remorselessly, relentlessly towards execution, which is the seizure of frozen Russian assets. And the author of that article, who was a professor at Cornell University, made the point that this is in effect an act of war, and that taking this extraordinary step, which cannot be justified legally, not only undermines the international law-based, the rules-based international order that the United States and the Europeans and the collective West endlessly talk about, but that it erodes the boundary between war and peace. And supplying long-range missiles to Ukraine, which could be used to launch, or which are intended to be used, to launch strikes on Russia itself. Classically, that would certainly have been considered an act of war. And of course, it too erodes the boundary between war and peace. Notice that throughout the Cold War, in the various proxy wars, that the Soviet Union and the United States waged against each other in places like Korea, Vietnam and Afghanistan and in other places. Nothing like that was ever done. It was always understood that you could supply weapons to the various sides that you supported, but they would use them against the other side's proxies. There was never any question of an actual attack on American or Soviet territory with the weapons that the other superpower was supplying to its proxies. Yet this time, it seems, at least if my analysis is correct, which by the way I suspect it is, we are heading towards the point when it is going to be done. We're going to probably see, my guess is sometime in February, announcements once Congress has been lent upon and has been perhaps persuaded to authorize more funding. We're going to see announcements both about the seizure of Russian assets and about the supply of long-range missiles to Ukraine. Missiles capable of and designed to strike at Russian territory. The boundary between war and peace is being steadily eroded away. Garland Nixon, that most insightful commentator in the United States, wrote to me many, many months ago in connection with certain steps that the administration was taking with respect to Taiwan, pointing out what an extremely dangerous administration this is. And we are going to see, or so I expect, further evidence of this. So that's, I think, where we're heading. We're heading towards a major escalation, not, however, an escalation that is going to change anything on the battlefields or change the situation in the war. Because that is the other absurd thing about this decision, if it is ever made, if it is made. The professor from Cornell University that I spoke about explained why seizing Russian assets, confiscating, stealing the assets, whatever you want to call it, why that's not going to change any calculus in the Kremlin. The Kremlin has probably written these assets off anyway. Stealing them and using them is illegal and unjustified, but it's not going to change Russian decision-making with respect to Ukraine. And the same applies to the supply of long-range missiles to Ukraine. If Ukraine starts using long-range missiles to launch at targets in Russia, the Kerch Bridge, Novorossiysk, Rostov, conceivably even Moscow itself, if Moscow is indeed within range of some of these missiles, which perhaps it is, would be extremely dangerous. They are, after all, American or NATO missiles. You could argue, you would be justified in arguing, that the Russian air controllers would not know whether these missiles were nuclear-armed American missiles or Ukrainian, conventional-armed Ukrainian missiles. But anyway, put that aside. You could launch all of these missiles. But Russia is the world's biggest country. You can't hope to target most of Russia with these missiles. Much of the Russian military-industrial complex is located far away in the Urals, a region I have visited, by the way, and I've seen some of the factories there, far beyond reach of whatever missiles the West supplies. The Russians have the most elaborate and sophisticated air defense system in the world. They will find a way to counter these missiles. They will be no more effective than any of the other wonder weapons that the West has supplied to Ukraine. And, of course, the one thing it will do is it will harden opinion in Russia even further. It will probably shock much of the rest of the world and make them even more willing to listen to Russian claims that this is a proxy war being fought by the West against Russia with the intention of undermining or even destroying that country. And it won't change the situation, either with the flow of weapons to the Russian army from the battlefronts, and it will not change the picture on the battlefronts themselves. And we're getting lots of information over the last couple of hours about the situation on the battlefronts. There's been another article in the Washington Post describing the dismal situation of Ukrainian troops who are being sent to their deaths, or likely deaths, in the bridgehead in Krinky. The Ukrainians are being sent to this bridgehead, but there's been interviews with Ukrainian soldiers who find themselves there, and they're all reporting to the Washington Post that they can't see any military logic in what they're being asked to do. Many of them are dying. Many of their comrades have already died. They're not able to liberate any of the cities. They're bottled up in this bridgehead. They're taking enormous losses. And as far as they can see, it is purely a media affair. And the same applies everywhere else on the battlefronts. Now, again, we are in the run-up to the Russian Orthodox Christmas. There's always less reporting at this time of year about what is going on, but the reports nonetheless are coming in. It seems that there's been a major Russian advance in the Liman area. The Russians play a complex game, it seems to me. If they stop advancing in Kupiansk, as they have been doing for some time now, they advance somewhere else, and they're advancing south of Kupiansk towards Liman. There's a place called, I believe, Tornoye. Again, I'm not absolutely sure of the correct pronunciation, but the Russians are pushing steadily from Kremenaya and Svatovo onward towards the Oskol River, advancing towards this place, and ultimately perhaps beyond it, towards Liman itself, a town which the Ukrainians recaptured in the autumn 2022 offensive. So, major Russian advance there. More reports of more Russian advances in the Marinka area, that they made more advances around Georgievka, this village to the west of Marinka. Apparently, the Russians have made a significant push there, and they continue to push in Novomikhailovka, this other village to the south of Marinka. There are lots of reports, not always easy to understand, or at least not always easy for me to understand, about what's going on in the Bakhmut area. Reports of Russian advances, Ukrainian counterattacks, various places. But anyway, the overall picture is clear enough. The Russians are continuing to advance around Bakhmut, clearing Bogdanovka, moving towards the canal to the east of Chasiv Yar, perhaps aiming to capture Chasiv Yar itself, perhaps not, we shall see. And also a cluster of reports coming out of Avdiivka of the Russians now pushing deeper into Avdiivka itself, the metropolitan area of Avdiivka, both from the south and from the north. There have been various claims in recent weeks that the Russians have been pushed back in the industrial suburbs to the north of Avdiivka, but it seems that actually isn't the case. It's the Russians, not the Ukrainians, who've been advancing here. At least these are what the reports are suggesting. And the Russians have been, anyway, pushing forward deeper into Avdiivka from the north as well as from the south. And clearly there is now an increasingly bitter battle for control of that town. And to the northwest of Avdiivka, reports that the Russians are continuing their steady advance up the railway line towards Okr. Again, I apologize if I'm getting the pronunciation of this village wrong. Supposedly, they've come up against Ukrainian defense lines, that these are difficult defense lines to crack, but there's some suggestions that maybe the Russians have already done this. We'll see. But anyway, whatever. Again, Russian advances in the Avdiivka area. So it seems the Russians continuing to push forward steadily on every part of the front lines. And the Daily Telegraph, by the way, is now reporting claims that the Russians are planning another major offensive in the Kharkiv area. Not exactly clear where that is going to be. Maybe it's going to be in the areas of Chernigov and Sumy, whatever, we shall see. But anyway, that there is plans for another big Russian advance in the north, which presumably is expected to happen at some point over the next few weeks. Now, whenever I discuss these Russian military operations, I get lots of reports from all sorts of people, or rather questions from all sorts of people. They ask me what effect on Russian military operations is the election in March in Russia going to have. My own view is that the effect is going to be minimal. I don't think anybody any longer in any place, whatever their views about Russian elections, seriously doubts that President Putin is going to be triumphantly re-elected in March. He has always been a risk-averse man. I think the military professionals who run the war, General Gerasimov, there's a report, by the way, that he's been killed. Well, we'll see. But I don't think so. But anyway, I don't think so. It was a report that was appearing in a few places, but the Ukrainians themselves have not claimed it. But anyway, the Russian military leadership also come across to me as deeply risk-averse people. I think that will continue in the run-up to the election, and I think it will continue after the election. The Russians will continue their policy of attrition. They will continue to build up overwhelming forces. They will commit those forces when they think the timing is right, and they're not going to let the election affect their timetable in any way. And certainly, I do not expect the Russians either to seek to wrap up the war in Ukraine before the election or discontinue the war in Ukraine once the election is out of the way. So I just wanted to say all of that. But the point is, the overall point I'm making is that the Russians are continuing their advance. They've just launched these huge, devastating missile strikes. And just as air defense, supplies of air defense missiles from the West, and tanks from the West, and howitzers from the West, and HIMARS rocket systems and ATACMS systems have not changed anything in the war, the same will be true of these long-range missiles when and if they are supplied. Every Western weapon delivery to Ukraine is represented when it is made as a game changer. I remember this time last year talking about the Western tanks, the Leopard 2s, the Challenger 2s, the Abrams tanks, and they were being spoken about in the same way, that they were going to be game-changer weapons, that they were going to transform the situation on the battlefronts. And, well, we saw during the summer offensive how that was not the case. And just as some people were investing too many hopes in those Western tanks, they're investing too many hopes in these long-range missiles, if and when, as I expect, they are delivered. And we've now had further evidence of the way in which the situation on the battlefronts is causing growing stress at the very highest levels of Ukraine's leadership. Because no less a person, the General Zaluzhny, the commander-in-chief, the military commander of Ukraine's armed forces, chief of its general staff, he turned up at the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada, and he took questions from MPs and debated with the MPs the new mobilization law. And he was asked questions. And, well, to put it simply, he had a meltdown. He got incredibly angry. I mean, he raised his voice and was making hand and arms gestures. It's the film is, well, the pictures are quite interesting and the accounts still more so. But anyway, he got angry. He said that he needs trained men, that he's desperately short of men. He urgently needs trained men, and that if the parliamentarians couldn't hurry up and provide them, well, rather than go on talking all the time about Zaluzhny's errors and all the problems, well, why don't they just go to the front lines and fight there themselves? And, well, I have to say it was an unusual performance, and the kind of performance that I would associate with a commander who is aware that he is losing the war and is finding it increasingly difficult to pretend otherwise. Certainly, a confident commander who thinks that things are going his way would not be behaving in this manner. And I suspect that, as well as the bad news from the battlefronts, he's probably also been unnerved by the devastating impact of the 2 Russian missile strikes. Perhaps a little bit like President Zelensky, he had over high expectations of the effectiveness of the Western air defense systems, as perhaps he previously did about the Western tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and artillery systems, and maybe he's been shaken by the revelation that they're not quite the game-changing weapons that he'd expected. But anyway, one way or the other, he did look unnerved and shaken. Some people, Dima at the Military Summary Channel, for example, has actually spoken about him sounding panicked. And I don't think that is an overstatement. So, whatever view you take of that, and by the way, let me say that if General Zaluzhny feels that he is losing the war and that Ukraine is losing the war, it is his duty as an officer to report that fact to his commanders, to his overall political leaders, to President Zelensky first and foremost, and perhaps to Western governments who are bankrolling and funding this war. There's no sign that he's doing that, by the way. I'm just saying. But anyway, if Zaluzhny feels that the war is being lost, one gets the increasing sense that more and more people in Ukraine now think that the war is being lost. There's been a cascade and further cascade of comments by Ukrainian soldiers I saw one from one particular Ukrainian soldier getting increasingly angry when he is being asked questions about how Russian soldiers are supposedly inferior to Ukrainian soldiers and how Russian military equipment is inferior to the equipment that the Ukrainians are using. And this Ukrainian soldier, who I understand is from the Azov battalion, anyway, he snaps back rather angrily in response to this. And speaking of the Azov battalion, there was an exchange of prisoners between Ukraine and Russia, and I understand that the Azov people are very, very angry that the Russians this time straightforwardly refused to include any of their captured fighters in the exchange. I'm just saying. So, Zaluzhny clearly worried about the progress of the war, having doubts about this, military situation becoming darker. There's been, I found it a frankly upsetting article in The Spectator, British magazine, important political affairs magazine, in which a commentator, I'm not going to read the article, I found it too upsetting actually. A political commentator there, an observer of the war, says that he's lost interest in the war, he's become bored by it because this is a David and Goliath struggle, and Goliath is winning. In other words, the Russians are defeating Ukraine, and there's nothing attractive about a story like that. I found this article incredibly callous and flippant and showing no sense of responsibility for the British role in this war. But I do suspect that it again reflects a sentiment amongst a large number of people in the West that the war is not going as expected, and because of that, they would rather stop thinking about it. So, sending missiles to Ukraine, long-range missiles to Ukraine, seizing Russian assets, eroding the boundary between war and peace, creates disastrous precedents, but it is not going to change the outcome, and that makes it even more irresponsible and reckless that something like this is apparently being considered. I say considered, I'm not certain that the plan to send long-range missiles is being considered. It's not been openly discussed, but I'm confident that it is, and in terms of the seizure of Russian assets, well, we know that it is. So, that's my overall take of the war in Ukraine. It's like, on this day, it is likely that at some point over the next few hours, we'll be hearing something from President Putin. We'll see whether or not he does announce a Christmas truce, as many people believe. But for the moment, at least, the Russians continue their offensive, their slow-motion offensive, with relatively limited forces. They continue to grind the Ukrainians down. They continue to wage attrition against the Ukrainians in critical areas: manpower, artillery shells, air defense systems. Neither the Ukrainians nor the West can make up the difference. The Russians are growing stronger every day, and that is the reality, which, so far as I can see, nothing now is going to change. Now, there have been lots of articles still appearing about negotiations, people trying to get negotiations going. I think it was Stephen Bryan at Asia Times who said that the Biden administration's attempts to jog the Ukrainians into opening talks with the Russians on a freezing of the conflict have failed and gone nowhere. He is advocating that the administration try to engineer some kind of regime change in Kiev, trying to get Zelensky out and presumably Zaluzhny or someone else in so that those negotiations can begin. My own sense is that in Washington, they've looked at that and they've decided that the risks are too great, that if Zelensky is leveraged out of power in that kind of way, there is a real possibility that the entire Ukrainian system, the entire state, will simply unravel and collapse, that it would not be able to withstand the illegitimacy of another coup or the political shock of the resignation of the country in wartime. And that's, I think, why they're now drifting towards these escalatory measures, the seizure of Russian assets, the supply to Ukraine of long-range missiles. We're back to the old failed strategy of arming Ukraine in order to force the Russians to back down on American terms. And the idea is that seizing the Russian assets and supplying these missiles to Ukraine, even if it doesn't achieve anything dramatic on the battlefronts, and I doubt that even people in Washington think it will, well, it will nonetheless tell the Russians that Western resolve is unchanging and that the West will continue to support Ukraine until the Russians do finally decide to capitulate. So that's, I think, where we're heading. I'm just going to add one last point, which is that, again, I've had from a source, a normally very reliable source, some accounts of the kind of discussions, informal discussions, that the Ukrainians and the Russians are supposed to have been engaging in with each other. I haven't had the details of the discussions themselves, but discussions of the people who were in touch. And I'm not going to name any names because I think that might be unwise. First of all, I don't know for a fact that these discussions took place. And if they did, I suspect that the people who have been identified would not be pleased with the fact that I have identified them, and it might conceivably even get them into some sort of trouble, and I don't want to do that. But anyway, suffice to say that in every single case, in the case of every one of the Ukrainians who have engaged in these contacts, they are people with whom I am familiar. I mean, I don't know them, but I am familiar with them from Ukrainian politics. And I would say that they're also people who have historically exercised significant influence in Ukraine. And I do think that they probably do have contacts within the Ukrainian government. But I don't believe that the Russians would in any conceivable way accept these people as representatives of the Ukrainian government or the sort of people that they would want to conduct negotiations with. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about Ukraine at the moment, because it does seem to me that we are now heading for another war. And there's been an article in Politico about this, and it is a very disturbing article indeed. What it says is, briefly, that the Biden administration now believes that a wider regional war in the Middle East is more likely than not. That the United States has made various attempts to contact the Iranian authorities to try to get Tehran supposedly to rein in Iran's regional proxies, Hezbollah, the militias in Syria and Iraq who are conducting the attacks on the US bases there, the Houthis, I will continue to call them the Houthis, Ansar Allah, I believe is what they call themselves, but I will continue to call the Houthis because that is the name most people know them by. The Houthis who are launching these attacks on the shipping in the Red Sea, that supposedly these contacts between the US and Iran have failed to achieve any outcome. The Iranians continue with their attacks, or rather the proxies of Iran continue with their attacks as before. In fact, if anything, they are escalating, and the United States, the government, the administration, is now very close to a decision that a strike on the Houthis, at least, must now happen. And there is a general expectation that once that strike happens, there will inevitably be a chain reaction. And that will, in turn, lead to a strike on Iran. And the article goes on to say that there are some members of the administration who are concerned about the electoral implications of this. They worry that President Biden was elected on a platform of ending the forever wars in the Middle East. He will, in contrast, have involved the United States in a much bigger war in the Middle East, potentially, than any one that we have seen up to now. So it'll be a complete reversal of this, of his original electoral platform. But supposedly this doesn't matter because American elections aren't decided on foreign policy. They are decided instead on domestic issues. And President Biden can nonetheless find some means to explain and rationalize that which he is increasingly deciding to do. Now, I have to say, first of all, that I think this is a disastrous course that the United States now seems to be moving towards. Firstly, and it is the least important thing in some respects, about President Biden's electoral prospects, I think the idea that another war in the Middle East is going to have only minor effect on his electoral prospects in the United States is a complacent one. If we're talking about Britain, I'm going to say straight away that there is no doubt at all that the position of the Blair government and of Prime Minister Blair himself was severely undermined within Britain by Britain's role, participation at Prime Minister Blair's intent in the 2003 Iraq war. So that, despite the fact that in Britain, as in the United States, it's always been the assumption that domestic politics rather than war is what decides outcomes. To be straightforward, I think that Prime Minister Blair would not have resigned from office in 2006 had he not taken Britain into the war in Iraq 3 years earlier. I'm just saying. So I think that the electoral consequences are perhaps being underestimated. But I'm not going to dwell on that because, as I said, in some respects, it is the least important thing. The most important thing is that the United States appears to be drifting into an armed confrontation with Iran. And it's not difficult to understand how we have got here. Way back in October, in the aftermath of the Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October, I said at the time that there was a choice, that either Israel could do what the Netanyahu government was anxious for it to do, march into Gaza, take the battle to Hamas. And I said at the time that I feared that that might be a very complicated and very difficult operation indeed, that it might go horribly wrong, that tens of thousands of civilians might be killed, that the political effect would be disastrous, that the economic effect on Israel long term might be disastrous as well, and that it will be a disaster politically, geopolitically, for the United States if it embraced Israel as it conducted this, in my opinion, deeply mistaken, very dangerous, and I will only say this gently, ethically dubious policy. That was one possible outcome that the United States could have backed, could have chosen. One possible course the United States could have chosen back in October. The other was to seek a diplomatic response to the events of the 7th of October, to go to the Security Council, to get the Security Council to agree on a resolution calling for the immediate release of all the hostages, for investigations to be launched into what actually happened on the 7th of October, investigations which might in time have resulted in the people who masterminded that operation perhaps being called to account, that kind of thing. I was sure that had that been followed, the outcome would have been much better for Israel and for the United States and for the Middle East and, by the way, for the people of Gaza. But of course, inevitably perhaps, the United States chose the first course. President Biden went to Israel. He embraced Prime Minister Netanyahu. He gave him in public a blank check. His officials, including Foreign Secretary of State Blinken, went around the Middle East trying to persuade Arab leaders, the Egyptian government, to allow the entire population of Gaza, so far as I could see, to be displaced into Egypt or Oman or Saudi Arabia. The Israelis, by the way, have still not apparently given up on that idea. They're now, as I discussed, I think, in a recent program, lobbying African countries to take these people in instead. Anyway, that was what the United States did. The result was exactly what I feared: a conflict in Gaza, tens of thousands of people killed. This is undisputable and indisputed, regardless of how great the numbers of people you see who have been killed actually is, but there's no doubt that it runs into the tens of thousands. The city of Gaza massively destroyed, a humanitarian catastrophe, and none of the political objectives achieved. Hamas still exists. It still occasionally launches rockets into Israel. It is still a coherent military force. It remains defiant. And there is no sign that that is going to change. And I suggested, again, that the obvious response to the failure of this strategy was to go along with what is now the overwhelming international consensus as reflected in increasing numbers of votes in the Security Council, in the General Assembly, and, well, we've also started to see the first legal moves, the first concerted legal moves by South Africa's application to the International Court of Justice, which should not be confused, by the way, with the International Criminal Court. Anyway, the United States could have responded to that by again getting ahead of the diplomacy, supporting a ceasefire itself, explaining to Israel, well, this policy is becoming politically impossible to support for the United States, that it is doing too much damage to the United States' international position, that it's causing too many problems domestically within the United States, amongst the US's European allies also. But of course, again, what we see is that even though some officials in the US government, perhaps National Security Advisor Sullivan, perhaps Secretary of State Blinken, who is now again apparently in one of his increasingly fruitless and pointless journeys around the Middle East. It seems that once again, it is the advocates of war who are winning out. And this despite the fact that war has been attempted ever since the events of the 7th of October, and it has not produced the desired political outcome. So instead of going for less war, despite the fact that the war you started isn't achieving what you want, well, the axiomatic, automatic response is to go for more war instead. And again, you might not agree with everything that the Russians say, but as I discussed yesterday in my program, comments by the Russian ambassador to the UN, Vasily Nebenzia, that the conflict in the Red Sea is directly connected to the conflict in Gaza is obviously correct. How does the United States imagine that it can persuade Iran to stop the Houthis doing what they're doing if the United States continues to obstruct ceasefire resolutions at the Security Council and continues to support Israel in its military campaign? Even if the Iranians wanted to tell the Houthis, stand down, the Iranians don't control the Houthis. It is a fundamental fallacy to suppose that the Houthis, one of the toughest, best organized, most battle-hardened militias or military forces in the Middle East, that they're simply proxies of Iran. I mean, the Houthis almost certainly would not accept any such advice if it came from Tehran. If the Iranians are not giving advice like that, it is almost certainly because they know it would not be heeded, and that trying to give that sort of advice to the Houthis is only going to result in the Iranians losing whatever influence over the Houthis the Iranians have. So, Blinken, again, traveling aimlessly around the Middle East, talking to all the wrong people, and the United States preparing for a war which even American officials appear to understand is going to lead inexorably to some kind of conflict, armed conflict with Iran. This at a time when Iran has joined the BRICS, when its economy is booming, when it has negotiated a major trade and arms deal with the Russians, where it has signed a free trade agreement with the Eurasian Economic Union, and when it is pitching itself as a potential trading partner and friend to both India and China. Not to mention the fact that, of course, it's achieved this great rapprochement with Saudi Arabia as well. In other words, taking on Iran at the moment, precisely the moment, when Iran has been most successful and most powerful. None of this makes any kind of strategic sense. And of course, there have been many suggestions in the past that the United States launch a missile strike on Iran. No explanation of what such a strike would achieve. But we can get some sense of how this might play out. We've now had 2 assassinations of people who might be said in kind of a way to be associated with Iran. One is Mr. Mousavi, who was a senior official in the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The other was a senior Hamas official in Beirut. I discussed yesterday in my program why I don't think the assassination of this man will have any bearing on the decisions that Hamas makes in Gaza. But we've had those 2 assassinations, and we've had this major bomb attack in Iran itself, which has killed over 100 people. And I, for one, strongly suspect that when the missiles are launched at Iran, all sorts of cells and activists and activities will be unleashed on Iran. We could see more bomb attacks, more things of that kind, like the one we've just seen. And there will be a major effort at that point to undermine and shake the Iranian government. After all, John Bolton, who is the godfather of all of these ideas, he's just written a recent piece in the Daily Telegraph in which he openly calls for the overthrow of the Iranian government, regime change in Tehran, and sees the missile strikes on Iran, which he advocates, as the first step in achieving that objective. But what if this objective cannot be achieved? What if the Iranian government is far stronger than people like Bolton imagine? What if its internal security agencies have already prepared to counter these kind of moves? What if the Iranian public, who have become long accustomed to the pressure on their country from the United States and its Western allies, not choose instead to rally behind their government once Iran is attacked in the way that people like John Bolton want it to be? What then? I don't think anybody seriously imagines that a couple of missile strikes on Iran can, in and of themselves, defeat that country militarily. Its armed forces are very powerful. The country is mountainous. It has a difficult geography. It has withstood major missile strikes and bombing strikes by Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. What if Iran comes out of this still standing? It's got allies in Russia now. The Russians are prepared to supply Iran with weapons. It's got multiple allies across the Middle East. Those allies would no doubt be activated. There could easily be a much wider war across the Middle East with Israel fighting Hezbollah, major battles in all kinds of places, and the United States desperately overextended around the world. Well, I don't know that this scenario that I have just outlined is the way things are going to play out. But I'm going to suggest that it is the most plausible scenario amongst those you could imagine if there really is a decision made by the United States to start a wider war in the Middle East, in which case there is going to be a major debacle in the United States, another major debacle in the Middle East, one at least as consequential as the debacle that is already emerging in the conflict in Ukraine, where, to be clear, every single calculation about sanctions, about weapons deliveries to Ukraine has fallen short. Nonetheless, I get the sense that the angry old man in the White House has made his decision. I think that there are all sorts of people who support him in Washington in that decision. And despite the efforts of people like Blinken and Sullivan to try and stop this runaway train, the earlier attempt to persuade the Israelis to pull their troops out of Gaza being one, the calling back of the Gerald Ford most probably being another, I suspect that the runaway train has now left the station and is trundling relentlessly towards its crash. Well, I will, in that case, do that which I always do. I will discuss and comment on this in these programs. I look upon these events with the deepest foreboding. I hope I'm proved wrong, but whatever happens, I will comment and discuss it on these programs. Anyway, this is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop where you can buy the amazing things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again for joining me today. More from me soon. Have a very good day. And, well, we'll see what happens both in Ukraine and in the Middle East.